Hey, yo. All right. We're here for the Sunday live stream. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. We're going to talk about eugenics. Uh, this is this is a long time coming. It actually stretches across modern politics. A lot of modern issues tied into eugenics, what we got going on right now, specifically our issues with immigration, our issues with our population, um, all that kind of stuff. We're going to touch on a whole lot of different things. We might be here for a while on this. This might be one of those 2 hour joints. It might actually be a 3 hour joint. I got a couple of books to summarize, and I got a case file to go through. So we may be here a minute or two. Okay. Um, if you're interested in eugenics, I definitely suggest you watch a documentary called the Maafa 21. It is a documentary specifically about eugenics and Black people. That is, I've seen that documentary a half dozen times already, and watching it recently is the reason why I decided to talk about eugenics today. Now, we're not going to go into any real detail about the entire eugenics movement. Just going to touch on some things, and we're going to use a couple of books. We're going to use Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, and we're going to use Thomas Leonard's book, Illiberal Reformers. Both books are about, well, medical apartheid is typical, kind of, I guess you could say, Black medical history book. But there's specifically a chapter in there about the eugenics movement. And Illiberal Reformers is about central planners in general and the progressive movement in the United States. But there's a lot of talk about eugenics in there as well. And then we have a a case file called "The Strange Career of Leo Stanley: Remaking Manhood and Medicine" at San Quentin State University. I'm gonna give you a taste of what this is. This was a prison surgeon that was removing people's testicles and attaching them to other men. We're going to get into that. Trust me, brother. That one was going to be by itself. But I decided to loop it on in here because it's kind of a eugenics story. So again, we're going to talk about eugenics. So what is eugenics? Well, eugenics, the term eugenics means well born, and it was actually uh, coined by Francis Galton, who was of course famously the cousin of Charles Darwin, who came up with the Darwinian theory of evolution. So the entire family is an interesting bunch. So we start kind of where medical apartheid and Thomas Leonard overlap, which is that there was a forced sterilization movement in the United States in the earliest 20th century. This, of course, would be made famous by my generation when it comes to Elaine Riddick, who was a young woman who was pressured. Well, she wasn't really even pressured. She was sterilized. She basically had a forced hysterectomy um, after going to a doctor. And people learned over time that this was something that doctors could do, and that doctors were often leveraging welfare benefits. Judges were doing this too, onto specifically poor women to get them to agree to stop having babies. And the general idea, of course, is that certain people should not have children. Now, this is a difficult subject because, well, shit, I think we all agree that not everybody is fit to be a parent. But it's all about how these things end up working out, isn't it? So, what we learned from these books is that from Harriet Washington's book, we find that the state of Indiana, the home of the Ku Klux Klan, in 1907, they were the first state to legalize sterilization for the mentally unfit. By 1935, 27 other states had followed suit and included the definition of people being feeble minded. These people will also be sterilized. Um, Blacks obviously were overrepresented in this group, and this was when the stigma of the welfare mother was created. And according to Thomas Leonard, 1911, there was forced sterilization in New Jersey, targeting quote unquote the criminal classes. In 1913, Wisconsin followed suit. And this eugenics movement was a movement of the upper classes. It was a movement of the well born and the high educated to reduce population and reduce the poor. They thought they were doing the right thing. Believe it or not, this is a situation where the villains think that they're the heroes. They think that they're doing a good thing by not overrunning the country with people who are feeble-minded, criminals, and unfit to be parents. So, because this was such a prominent elite belief, according to Thomas Leonard, there were 316 eugenics courses created between 1914 and 1928. Irving Fisher and John Harvey Kellogg, yes, Kellogg of the cereal brands of cornflakes and such, they said that eugenics should be made into a religion and that it should be the foremost plan of human redemption. In other words, stopping certain people from being born should be the best for our society. The belief, they believe that they were anti-war. These are the progressives of the 19th century. They believe that war destroyed good heredity because if you actually remember when the draft occurred, you could get actually medically dismissed from the draft if you had a critically low IQ or if you were obviously injured or something like that. And so what that meant was the good, healthy men went to fight in wars and they often died. So they were anti-war because they say, hey, good men go off and die in war, and what they leave behind are the medically unfit. The men who are not fit to defend the society are left behind to have all the children. Now that's a very interesting position that I never actually considered before. Yes, you want to have the best fighting men you can when you're having soldiers. But what does that mean for the women who are still in your society, where the only men that are remaining are men who are just getting out of prison or men who have some kind of medical exemption that kept them at home? Interesting. And one of those medical exemptions could be critically low IQ. In 1927, the Buck versus Bell decision was made in the United States Supreme Court that legalized involuntary sterilization. And they believed, well, Thomas Leonard believes that the first eugenicists were actually conservatives who were actually trying to define fitness with a social and economic position, meaning that if you were poor, you were socially unfit to be a mother, socially unfit to be a parent, and therefore you should be forced to give up your children or give up your right to have children. This was obviously quite insane. It was quite insane. According to Harriet Washington, a Mississippi legislator by the name of David H. Glass in 1958 sought to sterilize moms who were on welfare to quote discourage immorality in unmarried females. This, of course, included involuntary hysterectomies. So you have this entire movement that was created in the late 1800s, the late 19th century, and the early 20th century, where they're obsessed with central planning. Now, one of the reasons why these things started to morph and change over time is because it became so popular in the United States that it actually made its way over to Europe. And this was the cornerstone of what we refer to as National Socialism. The Germans picked it up, and, well, you see what they did with their gas chambers. So, eugenics, the idea that certain people are unfit to be in your society, the the idea that these people are taking advantage of you and of your goodwill, of them being welfare mothers and on the dole, etc., actually causes a great deal of drama, a great deal of trauma. And we have all of these ridiculous theories that spin out of it. Obviously, Margaret Sanger is an important part in both books, but we're going to save our Margaret Sanger talk for later. We're going to skip over her right now. We're going to talk about some of the people who were targeted as being unfit and feeble-minded. So, what the progressives of the era wanted to do was to cut down on immigrant populations. So, in Thomas Leonard's book, it says that immigrant populations were targeted due to labor conflicts. Now, what this means is that, and it's discussed later in the book, that Edward Ross, who is, I forget what he actually did, like what his position was. I didn't write it down, but he said that inferior races outbreed their superiors by living on less and accepting lower wages. And one of the groups that he targeted was the Chinese. And this led to, obviously, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Also, Eastern Europeans and the European immigrants were only accepted if they accepted American wage standards. So American worker standards were the only way you could become white. The Jews were targeted, the Italians. Eugene Debs, who ran for president of the United States, he was a socialist. You could probably go to Jacobin magazine or Marxist.org or whatever and look up how much they love the Eugene Debs, who was a union boss. He said that the Dagos lived like savage beasts. The Dagos are Italians because they came over to the United States and worked for less. I told you guys before that one of the reasons why unions formed was to prevent newly freed slaves from undercutting white worker wages. This was actually one of the ideas that would later be used against immigrants. The American Economic Association president Francis Walker referred to European immigrants, which he meant as Italians, Hungarians, Austrians, and Russians, as, quote, beaten men from beaten races, and that they were the worst failures in the struggles for existence. And he wanted to tax immigrants and force them to post a bond to enter the United States. Now, we're probably like one step away from doing that today. Like, I think Trump and these guys are very, very serious about their dislike of immigration. And our immigration system is pretty damn bad. All right. There's been plenty of stories coming out recently of the unchecked immigration in my state of Michigan, where now you have Muslims playing the call to prayer at 5 a.m., waking up their Christian neighbors and, causing all sorts of noise issues. You see that in the Somalians in Minnesota, where they're changing the state flag and all these sorts of things. And unchecked immigration is popping up all over the place. Now you have some societies like in California, maybe parts of Arizona, where you have to be bilingual in order to survive. And of course, Black people are not typically bilingual, so that becomes like a real issue. So they had these conversations way back in the gap. We're talking about 1890, and this guy said, "Wait a minute, there's too many immigrants here. We have to do something. So we should force them to pay a bond. And I believe the bond was $100. Think about that. $100 in 1890 to enter the country. That's what he wanted. He wanted them to have a $100 tax to enter the country. So John R. Commons of the American Association for Labor Legislation believed that a, quote, new race of humans was being formed who were inheriting traits of, quote, physical and moral degeneracy. Basically, we're mixing all of these people together, all of these poor classes of people, and they're all unfit physically and morally. And this new type of person is going to overrun our society and destroy it from the inside out. And John R. Commons suggested that we should organize American labor to combat the immigration system. And it was fully believed that we should keep wages high to reduce economic and racial consequences of wage competition. In other words, if you artificially raise the wages, you can prevent the immigrants from coming to your country and undercutting the wages of everyone else in your country. And you can only do that through unions. Now, that was back then. This was in, did I write down what year he said this? I did not. But it was in the progressive era. So it was probably like the 1890s or the 1920s or something like that. So there was another gentleman, Paul Kellogg, who was a journalist. He suggested another type of tariff on labor, which he called the minimum wage. I told you guys before that was one of the weapons that they used against newly freed slaves, minimum wages and unions. And they used it again. They wanted to use it again against immigrants. That unless an immigrant could guarantee he would make X amount of dollars, I think it was $2.50, he will be denied entry into the United States. The idea, of course, is keeping labor costs high. The point that you would keep labor costs high is to prevent what they call race suicide. Race suicide, of course, is the inferior races outbreeding their superiors. You know, the Chinese, the Jews, the Italians, et cetera, to prevent them from having children, well, prevent them from even coming here in the first place. You want to not have any opportunities for them. Therefore, they'll turn around and go back. At least that's what they hoped. Remember, at this time, there was not an expansive welfare system. So the idea that these individuals might be turned back by the lack of jobs was actually kind of an important piece to the argument. Of course, immigrants were targeted quite a bit in this scenario, but the Negroes were not in any way free from these situations. Frederick Hoffman, did I write down what he does? I did not. But they define blacks as lazy, trifling, and unreliable. Believed that blacks were doomed to extinction due to their racial inferiority. Thinking that blacks cannot take care of themselves after they were freed from slavery, that they will eventually all die out. Much how people talk about domesticated cats and domesticated dogs, that if you take your domesticated dog and you let him loose, he'll eventually starve to death because his natural instincts has been taken away from him. From the books that I've read on slavery, there was a bit of that. There was some slaves who were absolutely afraid to be free due to the fact of now they have to take care of themselves. And then there was plenty of people who, once they were freed, they didn't know what to do. And of course, this all depends a whole lot on what this person did for a living, whether they were a carpenter, whether they were a cotton picker, what they did on the plantation. A lot of that dictated how they saw freedom, right? If you could take care of yourself, if you had a skill, you know, you were a woodworker, you worked with steel or whatever the case may be, freedom is not that scary because you have a skill and you can go find a job and you can take care of yourself. You might get paid less than a white man, but you can take care of your family. But if you are a farmer and you were, picking strawberries or picking cotton or whatever, how are you going to take care of yourself? You don't have a field to pick. This is how they ended up, back on the cotton plantations doing sharecropping because of so many of them had only been farmers. They had only worked in fields and had only worked on agrarian soil, so they didn't know what else to do. So there was a belief that these Negroes would die out eventually. Like, unless we take care of them, what's going to happen to them? And this is how slavery persisted for so long. The slave masters looked at the situation and said, these poor Negroes, they can't take care of themselves. Somebody's got to feed them, clothe them, and take care of them. Somebody's got to care about their medical expenses. Somebody has to do this. If you don't do it, they'll die out. And this was one of the arguments, not only to keep blacks as slaves, but then once they were freed, it was a fear that the blacks would die out due to being racially inferior and not being able to take care of themselves. Richard Ely, who was a famous eugenicist, believed that Negroes were all just grown-up children. So, again, blacks were not in any way spared the rod when it comes to eugenics. There were the blacks, the immigrants, they were labeled unemployable, which means that they were low bidders for labor. Basically, they were undercutting the American, put that in quotations, labor market. They were considered parasites. And they said that they used economic competition to drag down their betters. They were seen as paupers, feeble-minded persons of low moral character. So if you could work, but you couldn't work, for the same amount of money as a white man, a good old American quote unquote white man, you were considered feeble-minded. So that goes back to our eugenics argument. Who is feeble-minded? What does that mean? Well, that means somebody who might be unemployed for a long time. But if they set up this system where you can't find a job, now a lot of this was targeting women, when it comes to feeble-mindedness and being mentally unfit and all this sort of stuff. A lot of this stuff was targeting women, but occasionally it targeted men too. But a whole hell of a lot of this stuff was targeting women. So obviously, we got ourselves a bit of a kerfuffle here about who gets to have children and who don't, and what this means. So we learned from Harriet Washington. There was a doctor by the name of Harry J. Heiselden, who was a eugenicist, who sought to hasten the death of children who were, quote, unfit for life. He suggested death for the genetically inferior. And often parents would volunteer their children born with birth defects. And eventually he started obviously targeting blacks. And of course, when you read this, you say to yourself, well, in the past, in the distant past, there were societies that what did they do with children who were born with Down syndrome? What did they do with them? They killed them, right? Our society, our world allows them to at least have an opportunity for life and to thrive. But back then, if you had autism, severe autism, or if you had some other kind of birth defect, they really didn't see a reason for you to live. Now, the 18th, 19th century, this is where people are starting to rationalize the things that they're doing, but it made perfect sense if you lived in a small village or a city state that you don't need people who can't work. You don't need people who can't take care of themselves, so you'll get rid of them. Even if it means you throw the baby off a cliff. It reminds you of that scene from 300, which is fictional, of course, where the baby is born, the baby is deformed, and he throws him off a cliff, and the baby still manages to survive, right? I used to read books written about Africa, and they used to say things like the Africans would tell them, if you pray for rain, a storm is a curse. So if you pray for a baby and you get twins, well, you're cursed. Something has to happen. Where why did God give you two children? You can't take care of two. You're going to take care of one. So they would take one of the babies or both of them out into the bush and they would leave them. And then they'd come back a day or two later. And if either one of the babies is still alive, that's the one that they would raise. This is a harsh reality that we live in, a really harsh world that we live in, where in the past, that's things that they did. You know, the idea that you might have been, people born today with no arms and no legs you know, and that sort of thing. And today you get an opportunity to live and try to live somewhat normally, but in the past, boy, they didn't see much use for you. Which is why if you ever hear about a lot of beggars and stuff like that in the past, a lot of them will be deformed. They either be super ugly, like lepers, or they have one arm, one leg, some kind of terminal illness where they're constantly coughing and stuff like that because society didn't know what to do with these people. And this is where you start saying that maybe eugenics is not the worst thing in the world. Maybe you don't want to just target immigrants or just target blacks or whatever the case may be, but why should your society be overrun with people who are low IQ, highly autistic, uh, Down syndrome, other kinds of birth defects? Like, why should those people continue to exist? Well, you have to accept that life is good in its own sake, right? You can't say that only certain lives matter, to use that terminology. You have to accept that all lives matter in order to accept why somebody who was born without arms and legs, while somebody who was born with severe brain damage, while somebody who might have been premature and underweight or something like that might get a chance at life. You have to actually value life. In the past, I'm not going to say they didn't value life. I'm saying they didn't have the resources to keep those people alive long term without those people being an intense drain on society. Right? And it wasn't a thing where the children of royalty or whatever were even um, exempt from this. There's plenty of stories of children who were considered unfit children. Usually they were just bastards. Their mothers weren't married to the father. And those children were killed. Usually the mothers were killed too, but the children would be killed. And your mother would be a concubine of the king or the chief or whatever. He'd get you pregnant, but he wasn't going to take care of you. And the official wife might not want that threat to the crown when the husband eventually dies, so they'll kill you off. Or you come from one of the lower classes of society and they want to kill you off. So you start asking questions about eugenics because it's a tough subject. And there is some merit to it. I mean, just being intellectually honest, there's merit to eugenics. Again, and I think about this all the time. If you have somebody in your family who only really has a successful life because your parents are taking care of them or because their parents are taking care of them, what do you do when that caretaker isn't there anymore? My mom had a situation like this where she had a friend and her friend has a niece who has special needs. And this niece is like in her 50s or something like that now. And the question is, you know, as my mom's friend gets older, she's in her 70s, her 80s, Who's going to take care of this 50-year-old special needs woman when she's gone? What's going to happen there? Now we're way beyond the idea of she should be put to sleep. She's 50, but her caretaker is getting old. Are we just going to say throw her in a system or some kind of system? Well, if you go back 100 years, they didn't have that system. That system didn't exist. All right. So yeah, they probably would have said you should have been put to sleep a long time ago for the betterment of not only your family, because you are a complete giant waste of resources. You can't work. You can barely think. Now you might be able to do menial tasks, maybe supervised, and that was another way of how people might have been labeled feeble-minded. Can you do tasks independently? You'll find out operating in the real world, especially if you become a supervisor or something like that. There's a lot of people who cannot do tasks without being supervised. That's why supervisors exist. This is why, overseers and drivers existed, because there were feeble-minded people who could not do simple tasks without somebody standing over their shoulder. There's people who work in my place of business who, I should say my job, who are the same way. They hire people with special needs to clean the toilets and mop the floors and stuff like that. And they're all special needs and they all need to be supervised. In a regular society 100 years ago, there is no such system to take care of these people. Who is going to do it? And these are all people older than me, and I'm 40. And you're talking about guys stumbling around 50, 60 years old, need to be supervised on how to clean a toilet or a sink every day. Now, you can't just teach them once and then walk away. Every day you have to stand there and make sure they do it. That's difficult, man. These people that we're talking about here, like the cornflakes guy, these people would have said, you should have just put that guy down a long time ago. He is a drain on society. Now, again, our society is much better at finding unique ways to keep people's quality of life, together. But then you have to beg the question, my God, not only are we giving these people jobs, but they have the opportunity to reproduce. Should we have people who can reproduce, who can't do menial tasks without being supervised? I don't know. That's a tough, tough, tough question. It's a moral question. It's an ethical question. For those of us who see life as valuable for its own sake, and we have the blessing of being around in 2025, we of course are disgusted by going back and reading how certain people were labeled feeble-minded or mentally unfit. But we realize that these people exist. They just had enough balls in the past to reckon with, we can't deal with this. Now, the big issue, of course, is that they were labeling large swaths of people, not individuals, but if you were Italian, or you were a beaten man from a beaten race, and you live like a savage beast, just by virtue of being Italian. Like that, we can't have that sort of thinking. We can't have you excluding the Chinese because, well, we think that the Chinese are what word did they use for the Chinese? Let me look and see if I can find the words that they use for the Chinese. That they were or that the whites were engaging in race suicide and doing business with the Chinese. Like this is not something that we can do today. But we recognize that these people exist. Now, obviously, you talk about eugenics. We got to talk about Margaret Sanger. So Margaret Sanger, she of course is the mother of Planned Parenthood. She used to run an organization called the American Birth Control League. Margaret Sanger believed that birth control could be a tool of eugenics and that it was favored by the higher classes, even though the lower classes were less likely to use it. Now, a lot of these people were also socialists. They were progressives, which means they believed in central planning, which is the central tenet of progressivism, not necessarily being left-wing politics as we see it today, but in central planning. So some of these people might have what you would call traditionally conservative values, but they are central planners, believing that that the government is responsible for planting and growing society. And a Nobel Prize winner by the name of Herman Mueller suggested that we turn to socialism because capitalism rewarded the unfit. That unfit people benefit too much from capitalism. Think about that for a second. But if you consider what we have been talking about earlier about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is labor restriction for the Chinese, which is labor restrictions on immigrants with the taxes and the minimum wages, a head tax on immigrants. If you take into account what they've done with the blacks in terms of taxes and minimum wages and unions to block them from labor as well, what they're saying is that the poorest among us, the poorest people, could come here and actually benefit themselves by working for less, which for them, there's no less than zero. If a white man charges 10 cents and you charge 8, yeah, you're not going to get paid the same thing, but you're benefiting. It's better than zero, which is usually the other option. Your option is what the white man makes and zero. And if you can get something in between what the white man makes and zero, you're coming out ahead. Because right now you got zero. And this is a conversation we constantly have with the socialist types when we talk about unions and minimum wages. It's like, is it better for somebody to make nothing or to make something? Even if it's below, quote unquote, a living wage. Is it better that they sit at home and do nothing? Constantly, you'll be told that it's better for these people to sit at home and do nothing. It's better for them to sit at home and draw Social Security or welfare than go to work. Well, this is how you got the welfare mother in the 1980s from Harriet Washington. She discusses that the welfare mothers. That stigma ended up sticking because there was a belief among whites that blacks would rather draw welfare than go to work. And this was in the 80s, right? So that means welfare has been around for a while. You know? But I was talking about Margaret Sanger. So Margaret Sanger starts talking about the welfare system, and she creates what's called the Negro Project. And the Negro Project, the purpose of the Negro Project, is to limit the Negro population, but specifically, she believed that the Negro districts in major American cities were, quote, the headquarters for the criminal element. Harriet Washington says that she often quoted W.E.B. Du Bois, yes, of the NAACP, of the talented 10th, who said that the mass of ignorant Negroes still breed carelessly and disastrously, and that they are the portion of the population who are the least intelligent and the least fit. So this is why she launched the Negro Project. And a Fisk University president by the name of Charles Johnson actually agreed with the Negro Project, saying that, quote, eugenic discrimination is necessary for blacks. W.B. Du Bois also gave Margaret Sanger the idea to target black churches. The belief being that if you get the church on your side, then people won't look at it as what it is, which is you targeting the black population. And this is where she started building her family planning, quote unquote, centers in black neighborhoods. Of course, these things would become Planned Parenthood later on. In 1967, the Black Power Conference in Newark, New Jersey, labeled birth control, the birth control pill, by the way, to be black genocide, and contraceptive clinics were burned down all across the country. This is something I've talked about before, because the radical blacks of the Black Panther Party, you could go back and look at some of their newspapers, because they have plenty of newspapers out there, and they talk about birth control and abortion as black genocide. And they talk about it constantly as black genocide. And then there is a switch in like the 1970s, I think, where they started talking about freedom of choice. And they started talking about the right to choose and all that sort of stuff. And I believe that was around the time Elaine Brown probably started taking over the paper, because Elaine Brown was fucking Huey Newton, and she was one of the editors of the newspaper, and whatever. She was kind of a feminist in that sense. But you could see that there was a change there on abortion. The Mafa 21 documentary actually points at Jesse Jackson, who was anti-abortion throughout the 60s and 70s. And then suddenly, when he wanted to run for president, all of a sudden he's pushing abortion because he wanted to run for president as a Democrat. But that wasn't it. Not only were they doing forced sterilizations all over the country, they were also, according to Harriet Washington, they were doing forced contraceptive. They had this thing called a Norplant, which was a hormone injection. It was like it's hard to explain it because I didn't actually see it, but it was a thing that they implanted into your arms for young women, and it releases a hormone that prevents you from getting pregnant. It was kind of like being injected with like a birth control pill or something like that. And it's supposed to last for 5 years, and then it has to be replaced. Well, this Norplant was actually injected in a lot of young black women from the ages of 14 to 19, but it had never been tested on women that young before. But the reason why they targeted them is because these women were often coerced into accepting a Norplant device in order to avoid jail time. So you had a lot of these forced sterilizations and forced contraceptives. They're still targeting the same groups that the eugenics movement is discussing: the poor, the mentally ill, the feeble-minded, the morons, the those people, and the young, the very, very young. They wanted to prevent teen pregnancy and all that kind of stuff. And they were saying that, hey, we could inject this device into you and you could avoid jail time. And some young black people were accepting it. Absolutely ridiculous. Of course, we're just now freeing ourselves from the shackles of Margaret Sanger with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But this stuff has been going on for decades. Absolutely for decades. Now, there's an interesting article that was written in 2001. It ended up in the book Freakonomics. I remember reading this in college and seeing a whole lot of I went to college in 2004, and it was still in the Freakonomics. It had just been taken out of the Freakonomics book, I think, or it had been revised, because there was a whole big hubbub about this. But it came from John Donahue III and Stephen Levitt in 2001. It's called The Impact of Legalized Abortion and Crime. And what they found, these are two economists, and what they found is that there was evidence that legalizing abortion led to crime reduction, right? And so a lot of people attacked these are two white guys, so they were attacked immediately for being eugenicists. They're suggesting that large populations of blacks who committed abortion is the reason why crime is going down. And they were forced to re-tackle this issue. Now, eventually they did stand behind what they said. They put all kind of asterisks and stuff in it. They put, they changed some of the wording from the original Freakonomics books to when they started reprinting them later on, to basically say that they're not promoting abortion or saying that yada yada yada. They're just looking at the correlation and all that kind of stuff, right? So this is how they came to this belief. They said that the women who are more likely to have abortions are women who are at risk, whose children will be at risk to criminal activities, will be teens, the unmarried, and the poor. And they all seek abortions at disproportionate rates. And he says these children and the children of these types of women commit the highest rates of crime. And they say we want to give these women the opportunity or the ability to delay child rearing. And he says that later on that there was a steep crime deduction in 1997, which is about 24 years after the legalization of abortion. And they estimated that the 1997 crime rate is 15 to 25% lower than it would have been absent abortion. So they say that abortion can account for 15 to 25% in the lowering of crime statistics. And then they say that increased imprisonment, which would be mandatory minimums and three strikes laws and stuff like that, lowered crime about 10%. And so these two policies equal about a 35% drop in criminal activity. Now, of course, we know that mandatory minimums have been dropped all over the place, and so has three strikes laws. A lot of that stuff was dropped due to quote unquote prison reform. So now you have a lot. You do have the crime rate. It's fluctuating, but it was going down pretty regularly because we were taking gangbangers and drug dealers off the street and giving them large amounts of time for carrying weed and cocaine and stuff like that. But now we're not doing that stuff anymore. They estimated a $30 billion social benefit to reducing crime. That means not just not housing them, but also, not having people that are in prison at the time, but also they're not committing property crimes. So they're not stealing, they're not destroying anything, et cetera, et cetera. And they believe that crime rates will fall 1% each year due to the legalization of abortion. This, of course, was again written in 2001. Roe v. Wade was overturned in, what was that, 2024? So it's a eugenics argument that they're making. They're not trying to make one. They don't want to make a eugenics argument, but that is what they're doing, right? They're saying of all of the, and they took the race part out of it. They just said the teens and unwed mother. It's black people, okay? Stop playing. It's the Negroes, all right? I think that part of the crime rate going down as well is that the economy did well in the 90s. The economy improved in the 90s. And I think that helped a little bit too. I don't think that poverty causes crime, but I do think that if it's easier to find work, people will choose work over criminal activity. And I do believe that sometimes that there is a correlation between it's too hard to find a job, So I'll just go steal because it's easier to steal than or sell drugs or whatever than it is to go and get a regular job. Okay. So I don't think that poverty causes crime. I believe crime causes poverty. But that don't mean that there aren't individuals who probably would choose to work rather than commit crimes if given that option. We can't keep taking that option away from them. All right. So that was all very interesting. Now let's get into this case study. The strange career of Leo Stanley remaking manhood and medicine at San Quentin State University. It was written by a guy by the name of Ethan Blue. And he says, this is from the abstract. Dr. Leo Stanley served as San Quentin's chief surgeon for nearly 4 decades. Stanley fixated on curing various crises of manhood. Under Stanley's scalpel, prisoners became subjects in a series of eugenic treatments ranging from sterilization to implanting testicular substances from executed prisoners and also goats into San Quentin inmates. Stanley was convinced that his research would rejuvenate aged men, control crime, and limit the reproduction of the unfit. We talk a lot about how eugenics tackles women, right? The forced sterilizations, the forced contraceptives. This is something specifically about a man who is targeting men for forced sterilization. So they tell the story about May 11th, 1928. Clarence Buck Kelly was hanged. He was he killed 3 people in a drunken spree 3 years earlier. So he killed people in 1925. He was hung in 1928. And after he was hung, Stanley had the dead man's testicles removed for experimental implantation into an aged prisoner. Kelly's mother sued Stanley for mutilating her son's body. The press seized on the story, describing the grieved mother and the perverse surgery on the corpse. But thanks to a medical insurance company and a timely defense by the dean of University of California's medical school, Stanley and his colleagues deflected the charges. Kelly's father was another of his patients at San Quentin. So that means that Clarence Kelly, he had a father who was also in prison. This absolutely falls right into what the eugenicists say. I remember talking to a guy not too long ago who was talking about Emmett Till. And he said, of course, Emmett Till did it. Emmett Till's father was executed for rape or something like that. Now, at the time, I didn't know that. Now, I don't know if he was executed for rape or if he got, something happened, but he had done something illegal that involved rape. And they were like, well, look at this. What's the likelihood that the son was beat to death for allegedly sexually assaulting a woman and the father had done something similar? It has to be genetic. And that kind of fucked with me because I was like, no, crime is not genetic, But there often are situations where fathers and sons both engage in the same criminal activity. How could that be? How can you explain that outside of it's genetic? So this is what eugenicists are working with. They're working with a situation here where they're saying crime is genetic. So it says Kelly's father was another of his patients at San Quentin. Stanley identified the elder Kelly as, quote, a pathetic madman in prison gray, serving a life sentence for robbery. Stanley thought Kelly's mother was a, quote, worn and pathetic figure in her cheap coat, who, like so many women, had collared her son, thereby wreaking, quote, unconscious ruination on his life. Stanley says Buck Kelly came from deficient stock. He still believed his testicles could be of good use. So, despite the fact that this doesn't make any sense, by the way. Like, his balls are his genetics, right? Why would you take his balls if his genetics are a problem? I don't get that. Why would you do that? Like the DNA in his nutsack is the same DNA that's in his forearm. You wouldn't, you're going to inject his criminal DNA into somebody else? That's crazy. So it says that Dr. Leo Stanley was the chief surgeon at San Quentin from 1913 to 1951. And he says California prisoners under Stanley's care became the subjects of medical, quote unquote, treatments from putatively voluntary sterilizations to testicular implantations. His practice combined eugenic sterilization with research in endocrinology with the goal of protecting society and rejuvenating an aging and threatened manhood. Stanley believed he would help a new ideal man emerge, physically and sexually vigorous, as well as being morally upright. And he sought to obviously bring some kind of solution to criminal behavior. So those were his goals. And it says all these stories here of this guy doing this stuff to these people. And he says Stanley saw his work as a constant contest between himself and the prisoners, a daily battle of wits in which each tried to outsmart the other. His oversight of some 150 executions between 1913 and 1940 certainly showed a willingness to play both roles as both humanitarian and custodial of crime, combating crime. He said Stanley was convinced that prisoners were, quote, constitutionally prone to complaint, that the men just constantly complained all the time. He says even those men mangled in the jute mill where protective equipment in short supply deserved little quarter. Despite numerous dangers arising simply from the physical space of the prison, Stanley was determined not to mollycoddle criminals, since that would only encourage their carelessness and laziness. This is a quote from Stanley, apparently. It has been necessary to develop a hard-boiled attitude in the handling of these men. When one of these individuals comes to the hospital having received a cut finger or some injury in the machinery, which necessitates sutures, instead of sympathizing with the individual and allowing him to believe his injuries are quite serious, we assume the opposite attitude towards him and pretend to upbraid him very strongly for his carelessness in getting injured in this way. Should we be particularly sympathetic? This man's injuries would probably prolong his stay in the hospital. Although they may think they are cruelly treated at this time, they feel much better about it when they have recovered. So he's been a drill sergeant to these guys, trying to get these guys to get back out there and saying, "Oh, I cut my finger, boss." He's like, "Well, that's your fault. You're careless. You're an idiot." The article continues saying, like many scientists, social planners, and progressive thinkers of his day, Stanley was a vocal eugenicist. He advocated limiting the reproduction of the so-called unfit and encouraging the reproduction of desired populations. And 1909, California passed their sterilization law, and it was refined again in 1913. In the next 70 years, more than 20,000 Californians were sterilized in a combination of voluntary and forced procedures for those deemed mentally ill, feeble-minded, or criminal. The vast majority of sterilizations took place in mental institutions rather than prisons. Stanley complained that prison inmates, of whom he believed 20% to be feeble-minded, should be sterilized much more frequently than permitted. After Buck versus Bell was passed in 1927, institutions across the country thereafter followed California's lead, enforcing involuntary sterilization. It says Stanley operated in the tradition of middle-class white male eugenicists driven by fears of race suicide, which is that the lower races would defeat their racial superiors by outbreeding them, which is literally what is the Muslims believe that they're going to do. Believe that. If I remember correctly, I think it might even be in the Quran, but I've heard Muslims actually say it, that they're going to overwhelm the white Christian world with babies, which is why they allow each other to marry their cousins and stuff. They don't really care about being mentally unfit, apparently. But it's driven by fears of race suicide and general anxiety about male potency. Cultural and gender historians have noted how the combination of urbanization, working class movements, women's suffrage, mass immigration, and imperial anxiety contributed to these fears about dangerously feminized white middle class manhood. And that's a big problem that we got today. There's a lot of soft middle class white dudes. The crisis of masculinity cut across the white working and middle classes. This is facts. This is still going on today. He says, while Stanley emphasized men's poor genetic material, he also blamed women's behavior because mothers were too soft on their sons. Ugh, that's probably a problem in the black community, where there seems to be two extremes in the black community. Either your mom cusses you out, calls you all kind of names, and is super abusive, in which case you're never at home, you're always in the street, and you end up joining a gang or something like that because your mom keeps emasculating you and you want to feel like a tough guy. But the other side is your mom takes care of you, your mom keeps you under her wing, and you're a part of the Dindu tribe, where you go out there, do something stupid, and then mom's on TV. Oh, my son didn't do nothing. He was a good boy on his way to choir. When all of a sudden, yada, 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 that kind of shit. That kind of stuff. It says, quote, the increasing use of involuntary sterilization in the 1930s prompted charges of racism and elitism. By the 1940s, American eugenicists had shifted their analysis away from strict racial control, which they increasingly understood as ineffective to which Nazism had given it a bad name. It says in 1946, Frederick Osborne, president of the American Eugenics Society, wrote that, quote, in 10 years from 1930 to 1940 marked a major change in eugenics thinking. Before 1930, eugenics had a racial and social class bias. Interesting. Very, very interesting, because it's true, obviously. Later on, it says Stanley and others increasingly turned their attention to gender and to homosexuality as a threat to proper families and healthy reproduction. Stanley turned his medical gaze to homosexual men, whom he likened to child abusers as perverts and sexual deviants. Perverts and sexual deviants. He said, quote, this was in line with his focus on the crisis of manhood in the first half of the 20th century. An inmate called Maurice was, quote unquote, a pretty boy of 26 years and fit for sterilization. Stanley believed that Maurice, as a prison queen, was more schooled in crime than many of his sin-scarred elders. Stanley linked homosexuality and bisexuality to sinister wrongdoing on many, many occasions, especially to California's mass murderers like James Bluebeard Watson and Gordon the Eight Boy Northcott, two San Quentin inmates who received a great deal of press attention and whom he knew in prison. Now, the whole thing with homosexuality and child abuse, there is a great link there. I know that people don't like to talk about that, but there is indeed a link between homosexuality and child abuse. There's a pretty stiff link there, especially when a lot of homosexuals report that they were abused as youths, and then also with the amount of mentorship that they do, that there's a really odd number of homosexuals who come into their sexuality when they meet somebody significantly older. Um, I remember having a girlfriend. She called me in the middle of the night once, and she was bawling, just crying so hard. And I'm like, "What is going on?" And she's like, "My brother, uh, my brother." I'm like, "Oh my god!" It took about 5 or 6 minutes to get her to calm down, and she was like, "My brother is gay. Uh, I don't want him to go to hell." I'm like, "He's gay? Like that's it? You call me acting like that because the guy is gay?" Turns out her brother went to college, met a man that was damn near twice his age, and started having a sexual relationship with this guy, and came out that he was gay. And I said, like, I've seen quite a few gay men who that is their story. They were young men who may have been curious or whatever the case may be, and they met somebody who was significantly older. And those people, I don't want to say coach them because you have to be gay already to be interested. Like you're not gonna talk me into having sex with a man. But that's their story is that they were doing that stuff. And it happens so often. I believe Milo Yiannopoulos, once he canceled for talking about his story of being molested by somebody in the Boy Scouts or something like that, and how he enjoyed it. And I think there was the Star Trek, the gay Asian on Star Trek, who went through the same thing. Who talked about coming of age and having his sexual relationship with a significantly older man. I mean, it's a weird thing. If all young women were having sex with guys twice their age, it would be a problem, and people would be in prison, and it would certainly be something that people talked about a whole lot more. But that's not really the case now, is it? All right. So legal limits on sterilizations, they came into play a little bit later, and it said despite legal limits on his ability to perform sterilization, Stanley advised all inmates that quote asexualization would do them good if they should happen to request it. In 1935, he posted the following note on San Quentin's main yard: sterilization. Recent research workers claim that the cutting of the G string in the male increases his general health and vigor. This simple operation prevents the man from producing children, but it does not interfere with his normal pleasures. In fact, it is claimed that sexual vigor, I'm sorry, is increased. With local anesthesia, the tube which carries the seed from the testicles is cut. This operation does not lay the patient up. Many having syphilis are less likely to transmit this disease if sterilized. Anyone who wishes to have this procedure done on him may apply at the line for sterilization. So he's soliciting sterilizations now. He's telling these guys, hey, come get sterilized. Your sexual vigor will increase, but it won't, and you won't be able to have children, but otherwise you'll be fine. This is where so many men start doing the things like, going to get vasectomies, right? So it says Stanley conducted a survey of prisoners whom he sterilized at San Quentin in 1936 and noted that the large majority, 115 out of 136, were of, quote, American nationality, presumably understood as white. White. So the vast majority of the men that he sterilized in 1936 were white. uh, he says 11 Mexicans who submitted to sterilization were the next largest group, only 11. followed by 4 Jews, 3 Italians, 2 Portuguese, and 1 English prisoner. It says it is difficult to read Stanley's understandings of race, ethnicity, and nationality through these statistics, but it appears that no black prisoners volunteered for this procedure. Understands that Italians and Jews and the Portuguese or Northern Mexicans are considered white, even though they're all considered white today. In the fiscal years 1937 and 1938, Stanley reported, quote, over 200 of the inmates have submitted to voluntary sterilization. When asked why they volunteered, 67 explained, seemingly reasonably, that they did not want any more children. Some offered inadvertent, if tragic, comments on their lives, perhaps influenced by Stanley's frequent injunctions that they may burden unborn children with a cursed inheritance of feeble mindedness or other troubles. Quote, do not want to bring anyone else into the world to suffer. We do not want to produce anyone who might have a hardships that I've gone through. That we do not want children to go through what I have. One noted his, quote, homosexual tendencies. Another was an epileptic and feared he might transmit the condition. Other explanations were less clear. Amazing. Amazing. The guy got sterilized because he says, I have homosexual tendencies. Again, there's this belief that homosexuality is genetic. I don't know. I don't know that to be true. I don't know that to be true. I don't know that to be true. It says 35 believe that sterilization, quote, would, quote, improve their health, likely influenced by Stanley's belief that vasectomy would increase vigor. 13 others volunteered, quote, because of being a convict. 13 more because they had syphilis, and 8 because they had gonorrhea. It is unclear how they saw sterilization as improving their lives. Yeah, they likely didn't know about penicillin. Even though I'm pretty sure penicillin was around in the 1940s. I know it wasn't around the 1920s because that's what took over Al Capone and ruined his brain. So we're going to keep skipping through this. I actually have a hard copy of this, so you probably hear the paper flipping. So Stanley's most reliable experiments began in 1918. These medical scientific investigations were structured by his preoccupations with manhood, sexuality, and aging. When executed men failed to provide enough testicular material, he began using testicles from goats, boars, rams, and deer. Started using animal parts. Animal parts. Animal glands became even more appealing in 1928, following the outcry of the Buck Kelly case. Oh. It says the first experiment sought to reclaim lost manhood for the elderly to rejuvenate them. The second experiment investigated what we would now call hormone effects on behavior, and the hormone we now call testosterone. And this will have implications for crime control. Crime control. He was implanting monkey glands into people. Sergei Voronov, a Russian-born but Paris-based researcher, extended the project by implanting monkey glands into senile men to public scorn and titillation. In 1925, he had performed some 300 of these surgeries on patients from around the world. Monkey glands. He started some shit. He started putting animal parts on people, man. This is ridiculous. It said by the 1930s, however, the mainstream medical establishment had begun to react quite negatively to any sort of rejuvenation research. In particular, the Journal of American Medical Association editor Morris Fishbein lambasted rejuvenation as quackery, a charge that clearly stung Stanley. They were trying to take old men and make them feel young again, like the Vulture in Spider-Man. He's going to steal your virility. which is amazing. Absolutely amazing stuff. But this is the stuff that science is made of. What if this stuff would have worked? That would have been my question. What if this would have worked? You have people drinking adrenochrome today. What you probably would have had is, my son is sick. He's dying. He's got stage 4 cancer. Cut his balls off and give them to me. You know, you would have had that kind of nonsense today. Crazy. Stanley's understanding of proper, stalwart, heterosexual, vigorous, and at times violent manhood was a key aspect of his character and his research. Men of what he considered indeterminate sexuality, whether bisexual, homosexual, or intersexual, were, he believed, a danger to society. Since he had made the case with Bluebeard, Watson, and 8-Boy Northcott, he added aging men to the list because he saw aging as a process of losing rather than changing manhood. Just as he linked murder and forgery with glandular defects and mass murder with sexual ambiguity, he believed that aging and senility were diseases that led to the sexual abuse of children and lamentable behaviors that cut across class lines. Senility and aging are diseases. That's interesting, man. This is a fucking interesting guy. He's fucking crazy, but he's interesting. So it says Stanley deemed his first experiments a success. Prior to the testicular graft, inmate Mark Williams, a 72-year-old white man, suffered from advanced senility, compounded by various ailments which afflict the aged. Yet, all of this changed after a younger man's testicles were grafted onto Williams, and Stanley reported a marked improvement in the patient's condition. According to the nurse's reports, Williams' eyes are brighter, and he is more active mentally and physically than a man many years his junior. He has more jazz and pep, and the energy of a man many years younger than he. Stanley said less of the donor. He did explain, however, that, quote, our first glandular implantation was performed thanks to the execution of a young Negro. The executed young Negro was Fred Miller, who was born in Kentucky and convicted of first-degree murder in Ventura County, California. Because no one claimed Miller's body for burial, his glands were available for Stanley's experiments. Stanley used material from other executed men to perform experiments on about 30 other men between 1918 and 1927 prior to the Kelly affair. Of those cases detailed in the 1920 article, 3 of the 4 donors were non-white, 1 Negro, a young Indian, and a Mexican, while none of the recipients' races were noted, which may have indicated that they were white. He was taking young black men's balls and glands and implanting them into white men. Yikes. It says Stanley believed he had separated manhood and masculinity from procreation, a division he took as the crux of Steinach's research on vasectomy and the importance of interstitial cells. Prisoners' manhood could be stimulated to beneficial moral and psychological effect without increasing their reproduction. In the case of implanting black men's cells into whites, this avoided the risk of inadvertent miscegenation. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. Says while initial experiments were undertaken with aged patients or those who had received testicular implants in mind, Stanley changed the researcher's goals as he continued. Indeed, he appeared to open the investigation to all subjects, and, quote, any who applied was given treatment. There is no record of whether or not he gave the shots to Black, Chinese, Filipino, Native American, or Mexican prisoners. although he likely did so from scientific curiosity. Nor is there any record of giving shots to prison queens, but he may have surmised that this took place since others involved in research on testosterone claimed that he could cure homosexuality. He thought he could cure homosexuality by giving you somebody else's glands. What the hell? Ugh. It says among the most consistent effects was increased sexual feeling. Almost all of the subjects reported increased sexual activity. Many who had not had erections for years claimed their virility had been restored. Prison is not the right place for have your virility restored. What are you going to do with a hard dick in prison? What are you going to do? I thought the plan was to stop people from being homosexuals. Either that or just going to be jacking off in a corner all goddamn night. That's just as bad. No, it's not just as bad. Being gay is bad. It's bad as hell. It sucks. It says among the most consistent effects had been increased sexual feeling, virility. One melancholic who would not talk or show any activity whatsoever was observed to have an erection a few days after implementation, and other prisoners reported that they had achieved orgasm under erotic stimulation. This result, what? In prison? Let's just hope they had pictures or books or something. This result fascinated Stanley and other rejuvenation enthusiasts, but it was a curious feature of his research. From a peniological perspective, it was hardly desirable to have a sexually excited all-male population. I know, right? It's not exactly a good idea. Says Stanley's research focused on restoring manhood to the age, but it also promised to age and crime control. Stanley performed the experiment on a 25-year-old man suffering, he said, from moron intelligence. Moron intelligence. You're suffering from moron intelligence. That is nasty, truly nasty work. Stanley told a reporter that implantation he was cured permanently of criminal tendencies, which is bullshit. You already know that, right? It says Stanley gave, quote, men renewed mental and physical vigor, revived interest in life, and newly formed conceptions of their moral obligations to society. Manhood and morality were indelibly linked in this formulation, whereby, quote, new strength, mental as well as physical, would follow the operation. This is insane. Many inmates did volunteer to have various human and animal glands injected into their bodies. 96 unconfined people, including 13 physicians, Stanley noted, also volunteered for the procedure in its first 3 years. So there were other doctors who said, if this works, I want to be in on the ground floor of this. These people clearly were not surgeons, scientists, right? You know what? I need some boar balls. Give me some of those boar balls. Give me some of those monkey glands. What the hell is wrong with these people? Some 500 inmates had volunteered to be in his research. In 1931 alone, Stanley did 520 implantations. By 1940, over 10,000 testicular implantations had taken place in San Quentin. It is not clear precisely when, but at some point early in the research, Stanley stopped thinking of this as an experimental testing Lidison's hypothesis, but rather a treatment. If this was a treatment, however, the specific ailment was never named. Stanley even went as so far as to invert the implications of the experimentation in terms of prisoners' economic class. Rather than seeing inmates as a hyper exploitable for this and other experiments, he believed that he offered a service that elsewhere, as in Europe, was reserved for the wealthy. So he thought he was doing good for the poor. This is doing good for you, poor man. Here, take some animal nuts, some animal glands. People are insane. It said inmate medical volunteerism during World War II took place in a in a decidedly self-sacrificing manner. Illinois prisoner Nathan Leopold, partner in crime of Richard Loeb, wrote at length of a clamoring to be used as a volunteer in World War II malaria toxicity experiments. When permission was granted, Leopold was jubilant. Wartime volunteers saw themselves as performing a service, for their country when they could not sacrifice their bodies in combat. Despite great discomfort, Leopold wrote, no volunteers complained. Every last one of them was a good soldier. San Quentin inmate H. Buderus von Karlshausen proudly informed readers that about 500 men volunteered as guinea pigs to allow the U.S. Navy physicians to conclude a series of experiments in order to prepare remedies or preventatives to fight the dreaded Spanish flu. Illness was a price many wartime prisoners gladly paid in order to sacrifice for their nation and to prove their belonging. Think about that for a second. You're in prison during World War II. You can't go fight in the war, but you hate Nazis. I want to do something. What can I do? Well, the U.S. Navy, they want to test some vaccines on, try to prevent the soldiers from getting the Spanish flu. You want to volunteer for this? Hell yeah, I'll do it. So you volunteered to be a guinea pig in prison in the hopes that your sacrifice would help the soldiers. We should get a record of these guys. And unless they're pedophiles, we probably should know who these people are, right? We should probably give them medals or something for volunteering for this. And we don't know how many soldiers over time, well, not soldiers, but prisoners, may have volunteered for stuff like this and actually helped our understanding of certain medical issues. It says, yet San Quentin prisoners may have needed little inducements to offer themselves to be used in these procedures. Inmates elsewhere in the country volunteered at high rates to participate in pellagra and encephalitis experiments. I'm pretty sure. Did I pronounce that right? Encephalitis experiments, as well as in malaria and other experiments during World War II. Although recent scholarship has demonstrated the inherent coercions in such volunteerism. I mean, clearly they're in prison and they're probably being told they're going to get released or something like that. But I want to look more into this. I should have read more of this and then decided to look into this inmate volunteerism thing, which I am now almost obsessed with. How many guys took this opportunity? I'm wondering. I'm very, very interested. When Stanley returned to San Quentin after serving as a Navy doctor in the Pacific during World War II, he found a very different institution. The California prison system had become a California Department of Corrections, solidifying reformist ideals within a centralized bureaucratic authority. Therapeutic penalty held a new sway, and Stanley was no longer able to perform vasectomies as he once had. Only 7 men were sterilized in 1946 and just 4 in 1949. So they changed the rules while he was gone. With a shift he had helped precipitate well underway, Leo Stanley retired from his work at San Quentin in 1951, opting to be a physician on cruise ships in enclosed institutions dedicated to leisure rather than punishment. In the past, he had waxed poetic about the men he cured, but when the 65-year-old Stanley retired, he resumed his hard-nosed attitude. A Time magazine article referred to the up-to-date medical treatment available for San Quentin inmates. Stanley responded that it was, quote, a hell of a lot more than a lot of them deserve. As Stanley aged, he spent more time with his second wife, whom he married in 1938, and his horses, riding through the hills of Marin County, a few miles from San Quentin, but a world away. Perhaps because he believed in the invigorating effects of vasectomy, He had the Steinach operation performed on himself. Perhaps it worked. He lived to 90 in 1974, 2 years before his death. Oral historians commented on his marvelous physical condition. Like a large number of eugenicists, he never had any children. It's hard to sit here and say that the guy who did all these things to these guys eventually had it done to himself. And of course, he never had any children. Of course not. That's very interesting. That's pretty much the end of the Leo Stanley story. Obviously, people are disgusted by this. If you bring it up, they'll say, "Oh no, what the hell?" And that the fact that this man did not go to prison because what he was doing was technically, I guess, legal. I guess you could say it was legal. Is bothersome to quite a few people. But just peering into our eugenics history, where in the Black community we talk a lot about abortion and the forced sterilizations of Fannie Lou Hamer and Elaine Riddick, forced hysterectomies, uh, forced contraceptive use. But it also applied to men too, and I'm pretty sure there's a bunch of Leo Stanleys out there who are testing on men, removing their testicles, and doing God knows what else. But we don't think about that stuff a lot. You know, we look at eugenics as being a thing that targeted women mostly, but it was a men's issue too. And I would imagine that men are probably considered feeble-minded and unfit more than women are, because if you look at a bell curve, there are more high intelligence men, and there's also more lower IQ men than there are women. Women have a more normal distribution of their intelligence, which is why women end up running the household more often than not, because either her husband is super smart and therefore he's never there because he's working all the time, or her husband is kind of an idiot and he needs her to balance the budget and you know buy the groceries and make sure the kids can read and all that kind of stuff. All right, this isn't go as long as I thought it was going to go. But then again, I did truncate it because I didn't open those other two books. I just read the notes that I had. If I'd have read through these books, well, for starters, the books in question are Illiberal Reformers from Thomas C. Leonard, is Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era. And another one is Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. Those are the two books that I used. I also quoted the Impact of Legalized Abortion and Crime from John Donahue and Stephen Levitt, as well as went through a case file of The Strange Career of Leo Stanley, Remaking Manhood and Medicine at San Quentin State University, 1913, to 1951 by Ethan Blue, who is an Australian, by the way, so he's not even American. Eugenics is a very interesting subject because it forces you to deal with things that we know are true, and it's more of an ethical and moral question than a policy question. We all believe in eugenics to some degree. That's one of the truths of the world. We see people who are struggling to survive and people who have issues, and we say, why do we let these people continue? For instance, something like schizophrenia, things like alcoholism. These things are genetic. They could be genetic. Things like bipolar disorder might be genetic. Is it appropriate to let people be born with these problems? Well, just because your father had schizophrenia doesn't necessarily mean you'll get it. I mean, that's true. You're at a higher risk of getting it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get it. Same thing with bipolar disorder. And then you also have these disorders that can be managed with medication. Just because, your mom or your uncle or whatever is not good at taking his meds doesn't mean that you won't be. So that's a question that we can deal with. Now, we always talk about the extremes. Trump recently, him and RFK were talking about autism and Tylenol and all this. That ended up being a whole ordeal, didn't it? You started seeing people on TikTok popping Tylenol, saying, "Oh, Tylenol is harmless," only to find tweets from Tylenol saying, "Don't do that," you know, without admitting that they have any sort of link to autism. They just say, "Yeah, don't do it. It's not safe." And then, of course, Trump is doing whatever he can to limit immigration, and people will say that's a eugenics argument. That's a eugenics position. Because the people who want Trump to do something about immigration, a lot of those people are, let's just say, white-centered, Eurocentric. There are too many Habibis, too many Pajits, too many Jose's and Marias. We don't need all of them, right? And they want Trump to do something about all of those people. No more Habibis in Dearborn and Hamtramck. No, we don't need no more of them. No more Pajits. Too many in California, too many in New York, too many Pajits. Jose's and Marias are taking over Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California. No, too many. Too many. Too many Jose's and Marias. But they're not doing so because they're racially inferior. They're doing so mostly because they come from foreign cultures. And there is some legitimate arguments to be had, especially about the Muslim population. One of the liberal arguments for immigration is, hey, the Jose's and Marias, they tend to be Catholics. That don't you want more Christians in your country? But they don't speak fucking English. So it's not gonna do us any good. They don't speak fucking English, man. Like they can learn, sure, but I don't know. I guess if you give somebody a choice, they'd rather take Jose and Maria over the Habibis. The Habibis don't speak English and are not Christians, and they change your culture once they get involved in it, and that's a problem. Right? That's a real problem. And to me, that's a major discussion. It's something worth having. And when you start talking about the Pajits, it's mostly economic. The Pajits come over here and they take high value jobs, engineering jobs and tech jobs and stuff. People don't like that. But they're not too concerned about Pajit culture. They're concerned about guys like Mamdani eating with their fingers and stuff. Eh. They're more worried about him being a communist than the fact that he's, a Pajit that eats with his hands. That's just one of the disgusting things that he does. But they're not really too concerned about that because they already know that he probably knows how to use a fork. He's just being performative by eating with his hands. Just like Jasmine Crockett, who speaks perfect English, and then she gets on TV and she starts talking like Shanae. Like we already know, she's code switching. She's putting on verbal blackface. And so Mamdani goes on TV eating with his hands, scooping with his fingers like he's some kind of third world Goomba. When we know that this guy comes from rich parents, we already know that he's doing Pajit face. He's doing this stuff to piss off the conservatives and upset them. But in reality, he's a well-born, high-class individual. The real concern is going to be the Habibis. That's a real concern. Look at England. Look at England. England is down bad. It's down bad. And Canada is full of Pajits. Somebody recently just put up like a list of like a bunch of government officials in Canada, and it was all last name Singh. Jeet Seek Singh head wraps, and I'm like, oh my God, what the hell happened to Canada? But the native population are not having any children. So that's why they want the immigration. The white population, they stopped reproducing. Now they blamed, all of the economic plans, and housing costs are too high, and opioids and all this sort of stuff. They blame all this shit. But the bottom line is the white population stopped having children. And the same thing happened, believe it or not, in the early 19th century. The mass immigration of Jews, Russians, Austrians, etc., into the United States was because the white population stopped having children. That really benefited the blacks and the immigrants, because now they need labor because the white population is not having any children. So they started making the immigrants white. The real the people that the Klan would consider white, those people are pretty much already gone. The Ku Klux Klan would not have considered James Gandolfini to be white. They would not have seen him as being a white man. All right. There's guys out here. Nick Fuentes is not a white man to like a Klansman. He's not. He might be a white supremacist, but he's not a white man. For starters, his name is Fuentes. You're already done. You might be a miscegenated kid too, so you're really not white. Okay. When this stuff was being done, the white population was already in decline. And now it's being in decline the world over. In pretty much every part of the world, the white population is declining. And now they're being defeated through the womb by the 10 billion Bajeets on the world, the who knows how many million Habibis, hundreds of millions of Habibis all over the place, and the Chinese. Hell, even Japan is importing immigrants from Africa. And now they're going to have a race problem in Japan. This is the new world. The native populations of a lot of these rich countries have committed what they call race suicide. This is just true. And now they need immigrants. Otherwise, the countries will be ghost towns. And there's a lot of reasons why that ended up happening. One of them was globalism, obviously. Competing with people all over the globe for jobs leads to people leaving your country to go to other places for better opportunities. Another has been the growth of women's movements. So now women are not at home anymore. They're chasing careers. They're having children later in life. So they're not having 10 kids, or they went from having 14 to having 5. Now the average woman barely has 1. And men have fewer women than children. So that's not even well, what did I say? They have fewer children than women. The average man doesn't have a child at all. You're talking to one. So now the question is, what do? You built this entire infrastructure. You built these entire cities like Detroit, cities like Baltimore and Washington, D.C. These cities were built for hundreds of thousands of people. Detroit was built and it had a population of like 500,000 to 1 million people at one point. There's not even half that many people in this city anymore. So you have tons of open space. What do? Just leave it to be dead like they have it in China or in Japan, where there's ghost towns? entire villages and stuff where there's buildings still standing, but nobody's lived there in years? Or do you bring in a population and say, here, you can have this piece of land here, and then as they build upon it, they bring in more, and then you end up with Dearborn, where you might have a small native population, but now there's more Habibis than there are natives, and they're playing the call to prayer at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you think that that's a problem. Wait, and that's only when they're 55% of the population. Wait till they're 70 or 80% of the population. Oh boy. Oh boy. Right? It ought to be interesting, man. I don't think I'm gonna be alive long enough to see it get really bad, but we're seeing the and I understand, there it should be said it's irreversible in some of these places. England is irreversible. And France is irreversible. It's never going back to the way it was. Never. You can sit here and listen to Sargon of Akkad and all these people talk about we're going to kick out all the Pajeets and all the Habibis, and you're not ever. It's never happening. If you ain't done it by now, you ain't gonna do it. There's more of them than there are you. And now they have control of your levers of government. So even if your judges are white, they're thinking Habibis first because that's the majority population. So you can have all the white judges and white prime ministers you want. The Habibis will come first because they are the fastly becoming the majority population. And if they don't get what they want, they're going to throw you out and start killing people, which you don't want. But the Habibis will do it. You should probably listen to Raymond Ibrahim, who talks about what happens when Muslims are once they become the the largest population in the general area, they start bringing in uh, Sharia law, right? And Sharia law only gives you three options: either you convert to Islam, you get killed, or you pay jizya, which is a tax, which is basically like a protection tax. You look at what's going on in Nigeria, where there's constant slaughters of Christians, and those are black Muslims killing black Christians, but the religion is the same. So everybody who is flipping out about the $100,000 over the Pajeets, I'm not concerned about the Pajeets. I don't care about them. I care about the Habibis, the Jose's and the Marias. They may be a little annoying, but the Habibis are a problem, and Europe is full of them. Europe is toast. All right, it's toast. It's full of Africans and Habibis. It's bad. Scotland, Ireland, they've reached the point of no return. And the native populations did that to themselves. They stopped having children and they started importing people from the third world. They did it to themselves. They committed race suicide. So the sad part is that the Irish and the Welsh, the Scottish, they exist nowhere else on the planet Earth. Once all of them are gone, they're gone. They're an extinct population. Once they're gone, they're gone. Once they're like dodo birds. They live on an island, bro, and they overrun their island with Africans and Habibis. Man, they're done. What's a Habibi? A Habibi is an Arab. Habibi is Arabic for brother. Trust me, I work with Arabs. So Europe is cooked, and they can have as many YouTubers as they want, claiming they're going to change the world. Ain't nothing changing, bro. It's over. Call it a day. You better off taking maybe a couple of cities and making them white towns or something like that. Because London is finished, Paris is cooked. You just forget it. Just forget it. I really do feel bad for the Irish and the Scottish though, because they were colonized for hundreds of years, and now there's not enough of them to fight back against this stuff. Their entire unique culture is going to be gone. You know, there's not going to be anything left, and they haven't. And it seems like the native population are not thinking about that. They don't care. They think that these Habibis and these Africans or whatever are going to carry it. It's not. They're not going to. No, they're not. They're not going to carry your Celtic culture into the future. They're going to destroy all of your monuments. They're going to destroy your old classic language. Is going to be gone. They're going to tear down your museums. They're going to destroy your churches. And there's not going to be anything of you left. And it's not me being, scare tacticking or anything like that. I don't live in those areas. But it's true. Why would they keep it? What do they need it for? Especially since they're calling you a racist right now and talking about how you're a colonial. If you're Irish, you've never colonized anyone. You've been colonized for years. If you're Scottish, you've never colonized anyone. You've been colonized for years. Hundreds of years. And you fought to keep what little unique culture that you have. And then in the next 80 years or so, it's going to be over. Because these people are already an old population. The Japanese too, but they kind of earned it because Imperial Japan sucked. I'm surprised they didn't bring in Koreans or the Vietnamese or something. Why did they bring in fucking Africans? I don't know. It don't matter to me anyway. I ain't Japanese. I do love anime though. It's going to definitely change once the Africans take over. But there it is. The big subject of eugenics. Obviously, we could have gone on longer and longer for this. You should watch the documentary, the Ma'afa 21, if you have time. Maybe if you are a person who are interested in this subject. The Ma'afa 21 is MAAFA 21. The documentary is on YouTube. You can watch it in its entirety. It's primarily about African Americans, but it gives you a lot more detail than what I got into. But it touches a lot on what Harriet Washington talked about in medical apartheid. It talks a lot about the eugenics movement targeting African Americans. I suggest everybody watch that. If I could have shared my screen, like if I could do like that fancy shit, I would just sit here and watch it and go through it with you guys. It's that dope. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the presentation. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.